Prigozhin came up behind a woman and strangled her until she almost died.
Was he assassinated?
For Prigozhin, the most profitable oil fields were right across on the other side of the deconfliction line. I have an offer for you. You can come and fight for me for 6 months. If you survive, you're a free man and your criminal record is expunged. I'm not getting enough ammunition for what we're trying to do. The Ministry of Defense is screwing over Wagner by not giving us enough ammunition, the ammunition that we need. Wagner is going to turn back from Ukraine into southern Russia, and they're going to capture and kill the Minister of Defense.
He didn't take into account one simple thing. Putin don't need.
Born in the 60s in the Soviet Union and sort of grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. He was a petty thief and kind of a small-time gangster in his teenage years, and he goes away to prison at the age of 18, if I remember correctly, for assault and robbery. He and his gang were on a street in Leningrad, which became St. Petersburg, and Prigozhin came up behind a woman and strangled her until she almost died, and then they robbed her, and he was caught and sent away for 9 years. And when he gets out, the Soviet Union is collapsing around him, and he returns to his native St. Petersburg, where first he falls in with some gangsters again in the 90s, which Murat had kind of alluded to previously with these various crime bosses and things. And so he falls in with some crime bosses himself, and they set him up as a manager of some grocery store chains. He eventually turns that into becoming a restaurateur of some very kind of fancy restaurants in St. Petersburg that a younger Vladimir Putin enjoyed. And he leveraged those relationships to eventually getting the job of providing meals to the whole Russian military and the Russian school system.
So he became close with Putin through his restaurant tours.
Well, as you'll see, kind of as we go through the story, he manages to connect with Putin. Putin likes him, but he's never able. He would always say that he was about one handshake away from Putin, and so Putin gets to know him. He kind of likes him because he's uncouth. He kind of has that sort of rough kind of attitude, which is somewhat refreshing given kind of the bureaucratic elite that are surrounding Putin. And so Prigozhin eventually gets this job to provide the meals for the Russian military.
Prigozhin wanted to seize this factory.
In 2016, Murat and Wagner, they capture Palmyra from ISIS. And Murat has, I think, some of the medals from that and from that time period that they'll show. But after the capture, the Russian military sends Wagner home again.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few months later, ISIS recaptures it, Palmyra, and Wagner comes back in. But this time, Prigozhin has signed a deal with Assad's government.
Yeah, yeah.
And part of the deal is that Wagner will participate in the counteroffensive, and Prigozhin and his companies get a 25% share of the proceeds of the oil and gas assets that are recuperated. And so Prigozhin has this massive incentive now to go out against ISIS and capture as much of those assets as he can. And so in 2017, Murat and Wagner are back in Syria. So Prigozhin wants this. Mm-hmm. And he's sending letters, too, to the Syrian government saying that they're not upholding their end of the bargain, that he's spending all of this money on the offensive and the Syrians aren't paying him. So he sees Conoco as the way to kind of get profitability, get out of the red and into the black. The only issue is that as ISIS is collapsing, everyone is thinking what a post-ISIS world is going to look like. So the Kurds, with the blessing of the U.S., start moving away from Raqqa and heading south towards Deir ez-Zor. And there's a rush for who's going to get this Conoco plan when ISIS is gone.
Prigozhin was convinced that American forces were not involved. His ego
His ego.
uh, rose above the common sense.
For Prigozhin, is that the most profitable oil fields are right across on the other side of the deconfliction line. And so Murat and Wagner, what they're doing prior to this is they're building up their forces. They're testing a little bit the line of deconfliction probably. Because they cross the river and there's this one little spot that is still Russian territory. And so the Americans are watching this on the drones, and they're seeing the buildup. They see it all day, and eventually, in the evening, they start calling the Russians over the deconfliction line that they have between the U.S. and Russian militaries, and they say, "Are these your guys?" And the Russian military says, "No. Why did the Russian Ministry of Defense deny that it was Russians who were attacking?" And there is an argument, I think, to be made. Like Prigozhin, his gamble in trying to take Conoco was that when the Americans saw that it was Russians coming, the Americans would want to avoid any direct confrontation, World War III, and they would back away and retreat along with the Kurds. And he was incredibly mistaken in that calculation. And what I think he wasn't counting on, and what Murat is saying, is that when the Americans were calling into the Ministry of Defense, you have some poor guy on the line who is also not going to be responsible for World War III. And so the quickest thing that you're going to do is not say, yeah, those are my guys attacking U.S. soldiers. You're going to say, don't know anything about it, don't know what you're talking about, and try to go to your higher-ups to cover your own butt. And so ultimately Prigozhin probably had kind of a wink and a nod from the Ministry of Defense that he was going to try to do this. And if it worked out, it's a great Russian victory for everybody. Assad, the Russians, Prigozhin. And if it doesn't, in the Ministry of Defense's mind, it's just Wagner guys who are getting killed. When Putin makes a decision to launch the full-scale war in Ukraine in February 2022, he gives the planning of it over to the general staff in the Ministry of Defense, and they want nothing to do with Prigozhin. And so their thinking at the time is that this is going to be a quick, easy victory, and we can do it kind of in their mind by the book without having to use guys like Prigozhin. And so in the initial month or so of the invasion, Wagner is actually left out. And Prigozhin is pissed about it. He's calling up the guys in the GRU, trying to figure out why his guys aren't in it, and then trying to get his guys into it. And meanwhile, the very quick operation to take Kiev does not go as planned, and the Russian military is suffering setbacks. And so Prigozhin now has his opportunity to get his guys into the war. When Wagner comes in with its commanders, they start delivering some quick battlefield victories. And so this puts Prigozhin all of a sudden in this great position. He's able to come out of the shadows, and he becomes a hero of Russia. He declares himself, he denied it always that he was tied to Wagner Group. Now he declares, I was always the founder of Wagner. And he's on state television. And as Murat said, this is a guy who already has a big ego, right? And the way that he always gets around his rivals is by gambling big, like at Hisham. And so he starts also promising things that he's going to do, something that the generals would never do. And ultimately, what he ends up promising is that he's going to, basically, Wagner is going to take Bakhmut, this kind of middle-sized city, from Ukrainian forces. And the way that he's going to do it is he gets exclusive permission for a time to go to all of Russia's prisons and recruit prisoners to the front line. And he comes in his helicopter, and he comes in and he speaks in front of all of the prisoners, and he says, you know, I have an offer for you. You can come and fight for me for 6 months, and if you survive, you're a free man, and your criminal record is expunged. And he tells them that my losses are worse than Stalingrad, which, you know, obviously resonates with Russians, and ultimately, about 50,000 guys sign up. We all know who Prigozhin is, right? During the Bakhmut campaign, he becomes like the face of the war itself. CNN is trying to reach him. The New York Times is trying to reach him for an interview. He's huge back home in Russia. He's like finally everything that he, his ego is matched now by, his popularity.
Yes, in this term, the Wagner Group completely fulfilled his mission in this war. They achieve their goals that would stand before them.
Yeah, but still, I mean, there's still a lot of enmity between the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and Prigozhin. And so at some point, inevitably, especially since Prigozhin is having all of this success, like Murat mentioned, the Ministry of Defense is going to want to check him. And so the first way that they do it is they start cutting off Prigozhin from convict recruitment. So he's promised to Putin, I'm going to take Bakhmut, but his means of doing so now is disappearing. He needs a lot of bodies to take Bakhmut. The Ministry of Defense is cutting him off of those bodies. Not because they're against prisoner recruitment, they just start doing it themselves. But the difference is, and this is always the issue for Prigozhin, is when he was doing it, he had the permission by like a wink and a nod from the presidential administration. When the Ministry of Defense does it, Russian parliament officially makes it legal for them to recruit from prison. So there's always a way that Prigozhin can get screwed over in whatever he's doing. So he's getting cut off. And so now he starts going public with the Ministry of Defense saying, I'm not getting enough ammunition for what we're trying to do. And the Ministry of Defense is screwing over Wagner by not giving us enough ammunition, the ammunition that we need. And so now this spat starts going very public over social media. And then ultimately, Shoigu and Prigozhin at this point hate each other's guts. And the Ministry of Defense then, kind of like their final kind of counterattack on Prigozhin, is they get the Kremlin to agree that all soldiers fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia have to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense.
Only those who fight on the front line.
Those on the
Ukraine.
front line. Yeah. And so for Prigozhin, you can imagine, he's this big guy now in Russia. He's got thousands and thousands of men ostensibly under his command. And he recognizes that this is making him political, too. And so all of a sudden, the Ministry of Defense is taking those men out from underneath him. And I think for him, what he saw was the writing on the wall, that at the very least, when I no longer have Wagner Group, it means that I'm going to kind of disappear into obscurity, which he wasn't able to do at that point. He couldn't just retire and be quiet. He was incapable of that. But also without those men, he doesn't have political leverage anymore, and it could result in his ultimate demise. And so he has to figure out a way, how do I convince Putin to choose between me and Shoigu? Because Putin is choosing Shoigu right now. And so the decision is made that Wagner is going to turn back from Ukraine into southern Russia, and they're going to capture and kill the Minister of Defense. And he also thinks too, or is hoping in the back of his mind, that all of that popularity that he had from being on social media and being on Russian TV on the front lines of Bakhmut means that the soldiers in the Russian military itself are on his side too. And so he goes and they've taken the military command and the generals who are there are trying to talk him down, and they're not able to do it. And so Prigozhin announces that they're going to have a march for justice on Moscow. At some point, he's trying to say, I'm not overthrowing the government, but now it's getting close to looking like he might overthrow the government if he gets into Moscow. And behind the scenes, the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, is negotiating between Putin's side and Prigozhin. And eventually, he gets Prigozhin to agree to halt the march. And I think for Prigozhin himself, he was a little bit relieved because he was realizing that events were going out of his control they were hardly in his control beforehand, but they were, as the closer he was getting to Moscow and they got within 150 miles, things were really starting to get out of control, and he backs down.
I think Prigozhin eventually realized that he didn't take into account one simple thing. Putin don't need the Ministry of Defense.
Was he assassinated?
Yes.
And
Do you think the государство убил Пригожина, да?
no, I don't know who exactly кстати, was как исполнитель.
Who was the actual person who did it? He doesn't know.
Who is actual person who did it? Prigozhin had many enemies.
And so when Prigozhin is gone, the Ministry of Defense has to figure out, how do we take over all of these things? Because Prigozhin wasn't just involved with mercenaries like Murat. He had troll farms, he had like chocolate museums in St. Petersburg, he had mining companies.
The main body of this project was not a Wagner Group.
Yeah.
Wagner Group only part of this project. Wagner Group, the military group that was used for the creation of the favorable environment to promote a business project
Of Prigozhin. So like Wagner,
Wagner Group is a part of the project.
Wagner was a way for Prigozhin to overcome his status as, an ex-con and try to show his worth to eventually join Putin's inner circle. He was never really able to do it. But so when he died, it was relatively easy for the Ministry of Defense in places like Syria or Libya just to have guys sign new contracts and to take over. But where they were acting independently in like the Central African Republic,
Central Defense.
the guys
special
showed up.
status.
Yeah, the
Industrial.
guys showed up and they were like, they couldn't understand it. There's breweries, there's all sorts of things going on, and so the decision is made: if it's not broke, let's not fix it.
And
let them just kind of keep doing their thing.
The industrial project in Central African Republic. This is a resource for the benefit of the president of Russia and his inner circle.
Yeah. So I think some account numbers got changed in terms of the transfers.
Okay.
But
It's a little bit difficult to take over.
yeah, because they don't understand it fully. Only the guys who work there know how it works.
Wagner Group is over.
It's over.
No matter where you're watching Sean Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, Share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.